You are a nobody. Don't pretend you matter, my mom said. Honestly, we forget you exist half the time, my brother added. So I clinked my fork against my glass and said, This won't take long, just 3 sentences. By the second, my mom's face had gone pale. It was Sunday evening in our Connecticut dining room, golden light making everything look expensive. Mom, Margaret, 65 and sharp despite 3 years of widowhood, sat at the head of our mahogany table. Jake, 30 with his Harvard law degree and designer confidence, occupied his usual spot to her right. Me? I was at the far end, close enough to hear, but far enough to be forgotten. The evening started normally. Mom glowed about Jake's promotion to senior partner, her voice carrying that pride reserved exclusively for her golden child. The Morrison case was brilliant, she said, cutting her roast chicken with surgical precision. Jake gestured with his wine glass, describing his courtroom victory, while rosemary and thyme mingled with Mom's Chanel perfume. I contributed occasional comments, but mostly existed in their peripheral vision. Then came the comparisons. It's wonderful having at least one successful child, Mom said, her tone loaded with familiar disdain. Her eyes flicked toward me, just long enough to drive the point home. Jake chuckled, that dismissive prep school sound I'd grown to hate. Some people just have it, others don't, he said without looking my way. When I tried mentioning my work project, Mom cut me off mid-sentence with those devastating words. You are a nobody, don't pretend you matter. Jake piled on immediately. Honestly, we forget you exist half the time. The casual cruelty, delivered like a weather report, hit harder than shouting would have. Something inside me crystallized, not anger, but absolute clarity. I reached for my fork, fingers brushing the vintage Patek Philippe watch they'd never bothered to notice. The metal against glass rang out sharp and commanding. This won't take long, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in years. Just 3 sentences. The room fell silent. Even the grandfather clock seemed to pause. I began with the first sentence, watching as Jake's smirk slowly faded into confusion. By the time I delivered the second sentence, I watched the color drain from Mom's face like someone had pulled a plug, her confident superiority melting into something approaching terror as she began to realize that her forgotten son might know something that could destroy everything. And in that moment of perfect, suffocating silence, I realized that after 28 years, my family was finally, truly listening to me. Growing up as the family afterthought wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone. For 28 years, I'd been the footnote in every family story, the one who didn't quite measure up to Jake's academic brilliance or social charm. When Jake graduated summa cum laude from Harvard, Mom threw a party for 50 people. When I graduated with my computer science degree, she took us to Applebee's. When Jake landed his first job at a prestigious Boston law firm, she called everyone she knew. When I got hired at a tech startup, she asked if I was sure it was a real job. The disparities weren't just emotional, they were documented everywhere. Family photos where I was consistently cropped out, Christmas cards that featured Margaret and Jake with me as an afterthought, birthday celebrations where my achievements were forgotten, but Jake's promotion got standing ovations. Mom's house was a shrine to Jake's success. His law degree prominently displayed in the living room, newspaper clippings of his court victories in frames, photos of him with local politicians scattered across every surface. My accomplishments lived in a drawer somewhere. Tonight felt different, though. Maybe it was how Mom kept glancing at me during dinner, or how Jake seemed more smug than usual. They'd actually invited me to this particular Sunday dinner, breaking their pattern of forgetting to include me in family gatherings. Jake was practically glowing as he described his latest success, a corporate merger that would net him a significant bonus. Mom hung on every word, her eyes bright with vicarious pride. $50,000, Jake announced, leaning back like a king surveying his domain. Not bad for a week's work. Mom clapped her hands together, the sound sharp in the dining room air. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. You deserve every penny." She turned to me with what might have been inclusion. "Jake works so hard for everything he has. It's important to appreciate success when you see it." The implication hung like smoke. Unlike some people who don't work hard and don't deserve success, Jake was already making plans for his windfall, upgrading his BMW, maybe vacationing in the Hamptons. Mom encouraged every extravagant idea, living vicariously through his prosperity. What struck me most was their complete obliviousness to the comfortable life surrounding them. This house is in one of Connecticut's most exclusive neighborhoods, with its perfectly manicured lawn and imported Italian fixtures. Jake's continued enrollment in an executive MBA program costs more than most people's annual salaries. Mom's weekly boutique trips and country club membership. Jake bragged about his success, while Mom gushed about their sophisticated lifestyle and future plans for even more luxury. They talked about money and achievement as if they'd earned every privilege, never questioning their good fortune or wondering about tomorrow. As I sat there, listening to them plan Jake's next extravagant purchase, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not anger, but profound clarity. The pressure that had been building for years, the constant weight of their disappointment and dismissal, had finally reached a breaking point. There were things they didn't know about me, secrets I'd kept for reasons that no longer seemed valid. And after tonight, they would have to face the truth, whether they were ready for it or not. The silence stretched between us, my second sentence hanging in the air like a blade waiting to fall. But my mind had drifted somewhere else, back to a conversation 3 years ago that I'd convinced myself meant nothing. Grandpa had called me on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice weak from cancer treatments, but carrying that urgency of someone whose time was running short. "Son," he'd said, struggling to catch his breath, "I'm leaving you something important. Remember to check everything carefully." I dismissed it as a dying man's ramblings, a desperate hope for one last gift. I'd always been Grandpa's favorite, though he'd never said it outright. While Mom fawned over Jake's achievements, Grandpa would pull me aside during gatherings to ask about my coding projects, genuinely interested in technical details that made everyone else's eyes glaze over. He'd been a successful businessman, something in manufacturing, but always seemed to see potential in me that my own mother missed. After his funeral, when I'd checked his old records, I discovered changes to my financial accounts that I couldn't explain, mysterious transfers that seemed too substantial to be real. The numbers felt abstract, like system glitches rather than actual money, but sitting at our dinner table, watching Mom and Jake grow agitated by my pause, nagging questions surfaced. Why had Grandpa seemed so concerned about my future with this family? Why had he made cryptic comments about needing to be strong and know my worth? In his final weeks, he'd kept asking if Mom and Jake were treating me well, eyes narrowing at my diplomatic non-answers. His grip during our last conversation, making me promise to never let them make you feel small, suddenly felt less like general encouragement and more like specific preparation for something he knew was coming. Mom was losing patience, manicured fingers drumming against the table in that rhythm, meaning an explosion was imminent. "Are you going to finish whatever little speech you're giving us, or should we clear the table?" she demanded, voice carrying that cutting edge I'd grown up hearing. Jake leaned forward, earlier amusement replaced by irritation. "Yeah, what's with the dramatic pause? Just say whatever you're going to say so we can move on." Something had shifted. They weren't treating this as a joke anymore. Tension had ratcheted up several notches, and I could see genuine concern flickering in their eyes. That's when Jake escalated things. He whispered something to Mom that I couldn't catch, but I saw her grim nod in response. "After dinner," she murmured back, "we'll handle this." The casual way they discussed handling me, like I was a problem to solve rather than a family member to hear, reminded me why I'd been preparing for this moment. But even as my resolve strengthened, I found myself staring at the vintage Patek Philippe on my wrist. The same watch Grandpa had insisted I take from his personal effects, despite Mom's protests that it was too valuable for someone like me. Sometimes the most important truths come when you're ready to hear them, he'd told me during our last conversation, and I'd assumed he meant accepting his death. But sitting there, feeling that expensive timepiece's weight against my skin, I began wondering if Grandpa had been preparing me for a different kind of revelation entirely. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if the 3 sentences I was about to speak would reveal the truth I thought I knew, or uncover something far more complicated than I'd ever imagined. The third sentence, I said, letting the words hang in the air before continuing, is that I'm not the failure you think I am. The look of confusion on their faces was almost comical, Jake's eyebrows knitting together, Mom's lips pursing as if she'd tasted something bitter. I'm not an IT support tech struggling to make ends meet, I continued, my voice gaining strength. I'm a senior software architect for CloudSphere Technologies. I make a very successful salary, and I've been doing it for 5 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake was the first to recover, his lawyer instincts kicking in as he leaned forward. Bullshit, he said flatly, his voice carrying that prosecutorial edge. You're telling me you've been lying about your job for 5 years? Prove it. His challenge hung in the air, sharp and demanding. Mom's face had gone through several color changes, from pale to flushed to something approaching gray. That's impossible, she whispered. You live in that tiny apartment, you drive that old Honda, you never have money for anything nice. Jake had moved into full attack mode, pointing an accusatory finger across the table. You know what I think? I think you're making this up to try to feel important. What's the company's phone number? Who's your manager? What projects are you working on? The rapid-fire questions came like bullets, each designed to expose what he was certain was an elaborate lie. I'm going to call them tomorrow morning and verify every word of this story, and when I find out you're lying, we're going to have a very different conversation about your place in this family. Mom had found her voice again, her tone ice cold. Stop this right now, she commanded, her words carrying the authority of 3 decades of family dynamics. You don't get to lie to us and then act like you're some kind of victim. This is exactly the kind of desperate behavior we've come to expect from you, making up stories to try to make yourself seem important when you know you'll never measure up to Jake's actual success. The attack was more vicious than I'd expected, but I'd prepared for this moment. I pulled out my phone and showed them my company email, my LinkedIn profile with over 10,000 connections in the tech industry, and a recent news article about a product launch I'd led that had generated millions in revenue. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but instead of acknowledging their mistake, they seemed to grow more desperate. So what? Jake finally snapped after studying my phone. So you make decent money. That doesn't change the fact that you've been lying to us for years. That doesn't change the fact that you're still you. But I could see something shifting behind their eyes, not respect or pride, but a different kind of calculation. Mom was doing mental arithmetic, trying to process this new information about her disappointing younger son. Jake was growing more agitated by the minute, his carefully constructed superiority complex starting to show cracks. But that's not even the whole story, I said quietly, watching as both of them leaned forward despite themselves. My career success? That's just one part of what you don't know about me. You want to hear something that might really surprise you? The question hung between us like a loaded gun, and I could see in their faces that they knew their comfortable world was about to change forever. The third sentence, I said, is that I'm not just a senior software architect. 3 years ago, Grandpa left me $2.8 million in a trust fund, and for the past decade, I've been the one paying for everything in this house. The words fell like bombs in the quiet dining room. Mom's wine glass slipped from her fingers, dark red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth. Jake's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. I pulled out folded papers, bank statements, wire transfer records, copies of checks I'd been keeping for exactly this moment. Every month for the past 10 years, I continued, spreading the documents across the table, I've been transferring $3,200 to cover the mortgage, $40,000 every September for Jake's MBA program, $2,400 monthly for maintenance, utilities, and household expenses, the country club membership, luxury car payments, designer clothes, all of it has been coming from accounts you never bothered to ask about. Mom was shaking her head frantically, her perfectly styled hair coming loose. That's impossible, she kept repeating, her voice growing more shrill. This house belonged to your father. The insurance money, my pension, we've been managing just fine without any help from you. But even as she spoke, I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. She was remembering all the times she'd wondered how they could afford their lifestyle, all the mysterious financial cushions that had appeared whenever money got tight. Jake had recovered enough to grab the papers, his lawyer training kicking in as he scrutinized every line. These could be fake, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence was too detailed, too consistent, too overwhelming. Why would you do this? He asked, and for the first time in my adult life, I heard something approaching vulnerability. Why would you hide this from us? Why would you let us think you were a failure? I looked at both of them, really looked at them, and saw not the successful, confident family members who had dismissed me for decades, but two people whose entire sense of superiority had just been revealed as elaborate fiction funded by the person they'd spent years treating as worthless. Because I wanted to see if you could love me for who I was, I said simply. I wanted to know if there was any part of you that cared about me as a person, not as a source of money or status. Mom's face had gone through anger and denial and was now settling into something that looked almost like panic. Honey, she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone I'd never heard before. You have to understand, we never meant to make you feel unwanted. You're family. You're my son. This is all just a misunderstanding. But her words felt hollow, desperate, like someone trying to repair a shattered window with tape. From tomorrow morning, I said, standing up from the table, all of those transfers stop. Every single payment ends. You'll need to figure out how to cover the mortgage yourself, how to pay for Jake's school, how to maintain this lifestyle that you've been taking credit for building. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Mom's sharp intake of breath. Jake found his voice first, his tone shifting between bargaining and threatening. You can't just cut us off, he said, standing up to face me. This is family money, Dad's money, Mom's money. You don't get to hold it hostage just because you're having some kind of emotional breakdown. But I was already moving toward the door, my hand on the car keys I'd kept in my pocket throughout dinner, prepared for exactly this moment. Actually, I said, turning back to face them, I can do exactly that. And I am. The finality in my voice seemed to hit them like a physical blow. $3,200 a month for the mortgage, I continued. $40,000 annually for the MBA program. $2,400 monthly for all your other expenses. As of tomorrow morning, every automatic transfer is canceled. Every payment arrangement is terminated. The desperation in their voices was immediate and overwhelming. Mom rushed around the table, reaching for my hands with a grip that was almost painful. Please, sweetheart, we can work this out. You're right. We haven't been appreciative enough. We can change. We can be better. Her words tumbled over each other in their urgency, promises spilling out like water from a broken dam. Jake was right behind her, his earlier hostility replaced by something approaching terror. Look, I'm sorry about what I said earlier. You know how families are, we say things we don't mean, but you can't just destroy everything over some hurt feelings. But I'd heard these promises before, in smaller doses, whenever they needed something from me. The difference now was the scale of their panic, the raw desperation as they realized the magnitude of what they were about to lose. You want to know what really hurts? I asked, my voice cutting through their pleas. It's not just that you treated me like I was worthless. It's that you never once wondered how we could afford all this. Not once did either of you ask where the money was coming from. Jake's face was flushing red, his lawyer instincts kicking in as he shifted tactics. "You can't do this legally," he threatened, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "That money belongs to the family. Dad's life insurance, Mom's pension. You've been stealing from us for years. And now you want to act like some kind of hero?" Mom was crying now, her mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. "How could you be so cruel?" she sobbed. "I raised you, I fed you, I loved you. How can you just throw away our family over money?" That's when I decided to deliver the final blow. "And here's something else you should know," I said, my voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I'm not just cutting off the money. When the bills come due and you can't pay them, when Jake has to drop out of his program and you have to sell this house, people will ask questions. I won't be lying to protect your reputation anymore. You'll have to face the truth on your own. Jake, you'll have to explain to your classmates why you're suddenly dropping out of the MBA program. Mom, you'll have to tell your book club friends why you're selling the house and moving into a small apartment." The color drained from both their faces as the social implications hit them. In their circle, financial failure wasn't just embarrassing, it was social suicide. "You wouldn't," Mom whispered, but she could see in my eyes that I absolutely would. Jake was shaking his head frantically. "That would destroy my career. The legal community here is small. If word gets out that my family is broke, it'll follow me forever." "You should have thought of that," I said simply, "before you spent 28 years making me feel invisible." I pulled my car keys from my pocket, the small metal sound unnaturally loud in the silence. "I've already moved my belongings to a new apartment. I've changed all my account information and phone numbers. By the time you wake up tomorrow morning, every financial connection between us will be severed." The reality of their situation was sinking in with devastating clarity. They had maybe 3 months before foreclosure proceedings. Jake's spring semester tuition was due in 6 weeks. As I walked toward the front door, Mom's voice followed me, no longer angry or demanding but broken and pleading. "Please don't leave us like this. We're your family. We love you." But the words felt too little, too late. Empty promises from people who had spent decades proving that their love was conditional at best. "Real families," I said without turning around, "don't make their children feel invisible." I stepped out into the cool Connecticut evening, the door closing behind me like a period at the end of a very long sentence. For the first time in 28 years, I felt like I could breathe freely. Walking away from that house felt like shedding a skin I'd outgrown decades ago. The weight I'd been carrying, the constant need to prove myself worthy of love, simply lifted off my shoulders with each step toward my car. Behind me, I could hear their panic through the windows, but those sounds felt distant now, like echoes from someone else's life. The month that followed was a masterclass in consequences. I watched as their world began to collapse. Jake's desperate phone calls, which I ignored. Mom's text messages about family loyalty, but her words felt hollow after decades of neglect. The telling moment came when Jake showed up at my apartment building, begging the security guard to let him up so he could talk sense into his brother. But it was the final email that revealed who they really were. Jake's message arrived 3 weeks after I'd cut them off. The subject line read, "You win," but the contents were pure venom disguised as wounded family loyalty. "I hope you're satisfied now that you've destroyed everything," he wrote. "Mom cries herself to sleep every night because of what you've done. You've torn apart our family over money, which makes you the most selfish person I've ever known." The email continued for paragraphs, painting me as a vindictive monster, conveniently forgetting that they had never questioned their good fortune. Even facing complete collapse, he couldn't acknowledge that they had treated me badly, much less apologize for decades of emotional abuse disguised as family dynamics. I read the email twice, then deleted it without responding. There was nothing left to say to people who could only see themselves as victims rather than architects of their own downfall. 6 months later, I heard they'd lost the house. Mom had moved into a small rental apartment. Jake had withdrawn from his MBA program and was struggling without the financial cushion he'd never realized he was depending on. The strangest part was how little satisfaction their suffering gave me. I'd expected to feel vindicated, but mostly I just felt free. Free from trying to earn love from people fundamentally incapable of giving it. Because here's what I learned. You can't force people to see your worth, but you can absolutely stop subsidizing their blindness. The people who matter don't need you to prove your value. But here's what I want to know. Did I go too far? Or was this the only way to protect my sanity? When you're trapped in a family that makes you feel worthless despite everything you give them, what's the right move? How far would you go to reclaim your self-worth? Share your thoughts below.